Bürger, the system of art is metastable, in the failure of the avant-garde. The revival of art as an institution and the revival of the category of work suggest that today the avant-garde is already historical. Even today, of course, attempts are made to continue the tradition of the avant-garde movements. That this concept can be put on paper without being a conspicuous oxymoron shows again that the avant-garde has become historical. But these attempts, such as the happenings, for example, which could be called neo-avant-gardiste, can no longer attain the protest value of Dadaist manifestations, even though they may be prepared and executed more perfectly than the former. Bürger, Theory of the Avant-Garde. This quote from Bürger illustrates one of the challenges the avant-garde faces in retaining a sense of tenability and achievability. The avant-garde, conceptualized as a movement or a period, historicizes it and renders it subsumable to the institution it serves as a polemical act against. The establishment of the neo-avant-garde further problematizes the avant-garde by inherently engendering it with a sense of oldness. Here is the vanguard's progeny, rather than affording the avant-garde presentness. In the hopes of keeping the spirit of the avant-garde alive, in avoiding this further concretization into the postmodern, it should be considered less as a gesture, a set period of disruption, and instead as an instantaneous state of higher energy. Drawing from the thermodynamic concept of metastability, that being a system that has or is characterized only by a slight margin of stability, there is a potential to re-envision the systems of art the avant-garde challenge in a more universal sense, as metastable systems rather than as purely autonomous ones. These systems are tense and conducive to change, but are frozen in equilibrium and incapable of changing unless a certain amount of radical energy is added to the system. A radical gesture, like the Dadaist or Fluxus movements, adds the amount of energy necessary to the system to overcome the potential energy that, in this case, the autonomy of art and of works themselves, keeps the system borderline static. Unfortunately, as Bürger mentions when discussing the effectiveness and inevitable impotency of shock and provocation with respect to the avant-garde, nothing loses its effectiveness more quickly than shock. By its very nature, it is a unique experience. As a result of repetition, it changes fundamentally. There is such a thing as expected shock. It is in this quote that the failure of the avant-garde is laid bare. The desire to repeat it with determinacy essentially defangs it and limits the energy it could add to the metastable system. The avant-garde cannot be predicted or prepared. To do so would go against the term's militaristic origins. It can instead be observed in its instantaneous action. The system is disrupted, but it will ultimately return back to that volatile state where an immeasurable amount of potential energy acts upon it. The avant-garde, in this sense, is less so a specific movement or time or work, but opened back up towards change and disruption, the dysregulation of a system. This paradigm hopes to open the avant-garde up to new systems in new mediums, like film and video games, whose novelty limits what could be considered avant-garde, with novelty instead denying it the spike in energy needed for that radical change. To help envision art as a metastable system, it may be easier to turn to the common analogy of a ball resting on the crest of a peak. The ball is simultaneously at rest, but also so charged with the potential to either roll back down or over the edge that it is frozen in an indeterminacy of action. The ball is not indecisive. There is instead a negation of activity, and each potential action is exercising an equal amount of potential energy. This analogy serves as an interesting divergence from the perceived flatness of equilibrium. The metastable system has a greater sensitivity to and range of expression when changes and disruptions do occur. An increase in the input of energy from either direction will overcome the opposing potential energy or energies and activate the metastable object, which will in turn exhaust this change and establish a new state of metastability, awaiting the next increase in energy. The system of art is metastable insofar as its autonomy, its institutions, its schools, and its markets keep it in a state of absolute stability. These forces are exacerbated by neoliberalism, which has propelled the production of culture towards industrial production. To historicize the avant-garde is to deny the system of art any potential disruptions, or relegate future disruptions to the realm of fads, temporal and tiring, not dissimilar to that of the neo-avant-garde Bürger critiques. While a rather grim outlook, it could be theorized that the avant-garde, as it is currently conceptualized, failed due to the metastability of the system of art itself. Its failure is predetermined, as the system will return to its state regardless of the disruption experienced. Dada was once tenacious, provocative, and inflammatory, only to have been captured and tamed, with the system it once abhorred ingratiating itself with and integrating itself into it. The avant-garde may be doomed to constantly fail well into the future if the re-establishment of a distinction between it and the postmodern is not made. The postmodern system of art problematizes the avant-garde further because so much of its effect was subsumed into it. The avant-garde moment, expressed in late modernity in its various forms, has essentially been canonized into the system of art, and even more so, the institutional forces that act upon it. This is not necessarily a failure, but something traceable far back into art's history, notably with the adoption of oil paint, for example, or the adoption of internet aesthetics into the system of art. Rather than failing at returning art to the praxis of life, or in more contemporaneous examples, the practice of unlife, if we're looking towards the cyber and digital, the avant-garde, indeterminately rolling the system of art's proverbial ball, either over or back down the peak, returned life, a hot flash of energy that disrupted its stillness, back to the system of art for a brief moment. The return to stillness draws attention to the forces of the institutions acting upon the system of art, mentioned earlier by Bürger. The system entered into another state of metastability, but not one identical to its last. This specific avant-garde action, or moment, becomes history, insofar as its moment has ended. But the mechanism of the avant-garde has not become history. The concept of the neo-avant-garde may not attain the same level of protest because the system it's protesting has changed its positioning or situation, so to speak. The neo-avant-garde becomes a new avant-garde moment, instead of a new avant-garde as a whole. The shapelessness of the avant-garde as energy allows it to be more broadly and openly applied, not necessarily recklessly or liberally, but instead with a greater range and higher acuity. A problem arises in how the avant-garde is felt as a phenomena. When is it possible to call a moment an avant-garde one, rather than a faddish one? Newness alone does not necessarily exert enough energy on the system to move the ball. The avant-garde precedes the main body, the legs propelling and extending past it. It is locomotive by nature, and we may only be able to recognize it once we have been made aware that we have reached our next destination in a series of many future ones.